Well, here are your national headlines this morning. President Trump says he's ending all trade negotiations with Canada. The president said on social media Thursday night he's taking that action because of Canadian ads.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is telling Southeast Asian leaders that Canada values a system that's based on rules while respecting trade agreements and the rule of law. This after President Trump announced he's increasing the tariff on Canada by 10% in response to the anti-tariff ad featuring the voice of former President Ronald Reagan. Eric Coro tells us more.
Something unusual unfolded in Washington, and its consequences are still spreading through boardrooms and trading floors. On October 23rd, Donald Trump posted a single sentence on Truth Social. All trade negotiations with Canada are terminated. No press conference, no diplomatic note, no prior signal. Only one message that would shake the foundation of North America's economy. It began with a political ad in Ontario. The provincial government had aired a $75 million anti-tariff campaign using the digitally restored voice of Ronald Reagan criticizing protectionist policies. Trump called the ad fake, accused Ottawa of crossing a line, and within minutes turned a provincial public relations stunt into a geopolitical confrontation. Within 24 hours, U.S. markets reacted. EV and clean energy stocks dropped more than 4%. Investors scrambled for clarity as supply chain executives warned of immediate instability across industries dependent on Canadian minerals and metals. For decades, those raw materials had been the backbone of America's auto, defense, and high-tech production. Now, almost overnight, that flow was in question. Canada's mining wealth has long been extraordinary. It holds vast reserves of lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth elements, the materials that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. In 2023 alone, Canada's mineral production was valued at over $70 billion. The country is one of the few democratic producers of minerals essential to the global energy transition. For Washington, this made Canada more than a neighbor. It was an industrial lifeline. Yet, in that one social media post, that relationship was placed on pause. Trump had often talked about reshoring industry, saying he wanted automakers to build in the United States instead of importing materials from abroad. But cutting off trade with Canada means more than reshoring. It means re-engineering an entire economy that depends on cross-border integration at nearly every level. The shock wasn't simply the announcement itself. It was what the announcement exposed, a fragile interdependence that few in Washington seem prepared to confront. For decades, the US and Canada functioned as two halves of a single production system. Their industries, from aluminum to semiconductors, were so deeply intertwined that shutting one off could stall the other. The sudden halt turned that quiet interdependence into a glaring vulnerability. For the first time in modern history, America's closest ally wasn't the one asking for concessions. It was the one holding the leverage. By ending negotiations, Washington effectively locked itself out of its own supply chain. Canada isn't an ordinary trading partner. It's the hidden infrastructure behind America's modern economy. In 2023 alone, it exported nearly $29.8 billion in critical minerals to the United States. Between 2018 and 2021, Canada supplied 45% of America's nickel, 66% of its zinc, 31% of its vanadium, and 16% of its cobalt, all classified by the Pentagon as essential for national security. These are the metals that make EV batteries, radar systems, and missile components possible. So when those negotiations collapsed, it wasn't a routine policy setback. It was a direct disruption of the only politically secure and geographically stable mineral supply the U.S. had left in the Western world. Analysts warned immediately that the consequences would cascade through manufacturing. Without Canadian inputs, one expert described America as a factory running out of raw materials in peak season. Within days, the tremors spread from government offices to assembly lines. Industries built around clean energy, battery production, and advanced electronics began to feel the strain. For years, those sectors relied heavily on steady imports from Canada and Mexico, two neighbors that had kept supply chains alive even during the pandemic and global shipping crises. But now, with Washington picking trade fights on three fronts, Canada, China, and Mexico, the entire North American production network began to seize up. Prices for lithium and cobalt surged between 12 and 18% within 2 weeks. The cost of producing each electric vehicle battery climbed by roughly $200 to $1,500 per car. Factory managers in Michigan and Texas reported production slowdowns of up to 20%, citing delays in material shipments. What began as a protectionist gesture was rapidly transforming into a self-inflicted chokehold on U.S. manufacturing. And because those industries supply so many others, the pressure quickly expanded. Economists warned that a 10% increase in copper prices alone could lift national inflation by another 0.2%, forcing the Federal Reserve into a tightening dilemma right in the middle of an election year. While Washington paused, Ottawa moved. Prime Minister Mark Carney responded not with rhetoric, but with strategy. Instead of escalating the dispute, his government began drawing new trade routes across the global map. On October 13, 2025, Canada signed a critical partnership with India focused on minerals and agricultural exports, opening access to one of the fastest-growing markets in South Asia. A few weeks earlier, on August 26th, Canada and Germany had announced a joint declaration on mineral processing, refining, and recycling, creating shared industrial infrastructure designed to bypass U.S. bottlenecks altogether. Soon after, Japan and the European Union joined in through bilateral agreements to coordinate data, standards, and sustainability rules on critical mineral production. At the same time, Europe's industrial giants began to act. BASF, Umicore, and Rio Tinto expanded their operations in Ontario and Quebec, fueling what investors started calling the Clean Mineral Belt. Through these calculated steps, Canada transformed its position from dependent supplier to independent powerhouse. In a global environment dominated by trade wars, it presented itself as the stable, transparent, and politically neutral source the West desperately needed. What started as defensive maneuvering quickly became an offensive play. While the United States turned inward, Canada built outward. It began connecting resource-rich territories with advanced economies, reshaping the supply landscape that underpinned the Western industrial world. Under Carney's leadership, Ottawa has recast itself as the architect of what is now referred to as the Western Mineral Network. More than 31 Canadian critical minerals are officially listed in the G7 Strategic Resource Framework, giving the country top-tier access to international investment and security cooperation. Early in 2025, the Canadian government launched a $122.5 billion Clean Minerals Transition Fund aimed at expanding mining, refining, and recycling capacity within national borders. It's not merely about extracting more material. It's about mastering the entire chain, from raw ore to finished battery components, ensuring that every stage of production remains under Canadian control. The results have been rapid. With transparent regulations, strong environmental oversight, and predictable policy, Canada has secured long-term supply contracts with the European Union and Japan, replacing deals once dominated by the United States. As these networks deepen, Canada now indirectly oversees access to nearly 40% of the G7's total supply of critical minerals. For a country once considered a junior partner in North American trade, it is an extraordinary shift. In a matter of months, the direction of Western industry has turned north. The world's industrial lifeline, once running through Washington, now runs through Ottawa. But every power shift has consequences. By severing ties, Washington didn't only lose a trade partner, it revealed a deeper weakness within its own system. The philosophy of America First is slowly morphing into America Alone. The costs are mounting quickly. U.S. manufacturers, especially in electric vehicles and clean technology, are now paying nearly double what European and Canadian competitors pay for the same raw materials. With access to stable suppliers cut off, companies like Tesla, Ford, and Rivian have been forced to look farther afield, to Indonesia, the Philippines, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where prices swing wildly and logistics are unreliable. The geopolitical risk is higher, and every shipment now carries uncertainty. That instability has started to appear in quarterly reports. By the fourth quarter of 2025, profits across America's high-tech manufacturing sector had fallen by 6.8%, marking a second straight quarterly decline. Battery makers, semiconductor firms, and even defense contractors are feeling the pinch. Each depends on materials that once flowed freely from Canadian mines. Supply shortages have slowed output, raised costs, and undermined investor confidence. Meanwhile, north of the border, the contrast could not be sharper. Canada, along with the European Union and Japan, launched a $40 billion trilateral investment framework focused on securing critical minerals and expanding clean energy production. Through this initiative, they are coordinating everything from mining to recycling, ensuring predictable access and technological innovation across continents. As these partnerships grow, the United States finds itself increasingly isolated from the economic system it once designed. The hub of Western industrial security is shifting, and Washington is no longer at its center. The isolation is already visible in trade data. American manufacturers are paying more and waiting longer for essential imports because they must now negotiate through intermediaries, often European corporations with direct ties to Canadian suppliers. Each additional layer increases both cost and delay. A supply chain that once took weeks to navigate can now take months. For industries where timing dictates competitiveness, that lag can determine survival. Other nations are watching closely. Mid-sized economies such as Australia, Norway, and Chile are studying Canada's model, exploring how to redesign their own resource policies to balance economic growth with geopolitical leverage. They see in Canada's rise a blueprint for how smaller nations can use minerals not as commodities, but as strategic tools. It's a shift in thinking that Washington once pioneered, but no longer controls. So what do you think? Tell us in the comments, subscribe to our channel, and hit that like button. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you in the next one.